When you think of video games, what do you think of? Mario? Sonic? Kirby? Burger King? Well, none of these would be possible without video game consoles, and without the Atari, you wouldn't have that PS5. So let's explore the history of video game consoles. The idea of using electronics to play games could be seen in laboratories and colleges across the US, such as Space War. But it wasn't until 1972, with the release of the Magnavox Odyssey, that the regular Joe like you and me could play these games. Speaking of which, the Magnavox Odyssey, which, as I explained earlier, was the first console that brought video games to consumers' homes. Its launch price was a modest $99, and only sold 330,000 systems, and most of them probably only bought it for the card and board games. This was a super basic console. Since cartridges didn't exist yet, they came up with a great solution: to pack multiple games inside the console. There were cartridges, but they just rewired the console. The gameplay was very lackluster. Overall, pretty boring. Next up is more like a genre of consoles, the Pong consoles. There were more than 300 models of this game on the market, quite a selection to choose from, which then led to the video game crash of 1977. Since everyone was just making the same thing, obviously people would just stop buying them. I mean, what do you want me to do, buy another $100 console? The first generation was pretty boring, but trust me, it gets better from here. Within about a year or so, technology for video games has tremendously advanced. So hopefully we see some good consoles and not just people trying to cash in on the trend. We start off with the Fairchild Channel F, the first game console to use cartridges. So obviously it was a huge success, right? Wrong. It had a whopping 26 games released on it, whereas its competitor, the Atari 2600, had more than 450 games released on it. They also released a second one, which also played sound through the TV speakers and had removable controllers. I seriously think this could have been a success if they cared even a little bit about their games. Now for the Atari 2600. This classic console is one of the most iconic consoles ever made, with amazing-ish games. I would also like to mention that this is all that's inside the console. Seriously, this is all the hardware. That's it. They were also planning to release the Atari 2700, which was supposed to be the first console to have wireless controllers using radio frequencies. What could go wrong? Well, it would also affect nearby consoles and wireless devices. I seriously don't know what they were thinking with that one. Now, for the console you've all been waiting for, the long-awaited sequel to the Magnavox Odyssey, the Magnavox Odyssey 2, the second Odyssey. Literally. Nothing special about this other than it had a built-in keyboard. Just a straight-to-cartridge console, if you ask me. Now for the Intellivision. The Intellivision was a console made by Mattel. You know, the company that makes Barbie dolls? It also sold more than 3 million systems, which is pretty good, but not enough to beat the Atari 2600. Mattel released an Intellivision 2, which sold poorly due to the crash of '83, which led to them losing millions of dollars. Next is the Commodore 64, a smash hit. It was a very powerful computer for a pretty appealing price. It was also good for gaming and went on to become one of the best-selling computers of all time. They also had a successor, the Commodore 128, which only lasted 4 years on the market compared to its predecessor lasting 12. And also the Commodore 128 only sold 4 million systems compared to the 64's 15 million. Now, the Vectrex was an interesting console, to say the least. It had a modified television which was necessary for its vector graphics. That was the Vectrex gimmick. Instead of boring sprites, they used lines. Due to all of this, it was limited to black and white. It was very short-lived due to the video game Crash coming right after its release. Very interesting console, though. Next is the long-awaited sequel to the RCA Studio, the RCA Studio 2. Oh, wait, 1 second. I'm getting some info here. Yeah? Okay. Oh, interesting. Sorry, folks, there was no RCA Studio. This was the first and only console that RCA ever made. It could only play games in black and white, and the games were subpar, to say the least. Hey look, Atari has just come out of their 5-year slumber to release the Atari 5200, which failed due to the crash of '83. Hey, did you know arcades exist? Now, I'm sure most of you think that the first handheld was the Game Boy. Some of you clever ones might think that it's the Game & Watch. But only the pro gamers know that it's the Microvision, aka a brown Wii remote with a screen on it. This Wii remote, I guess, had a 16 by 16 pixel screen. Tiny, tiny little thing. And it had many, many limitations and only lasted 2 years on the market before being discontinued. The screen would also, quote-unquote, rot. The poor screen sealing resulted in the liquid crystal leaking out, and it would permanently darken the screen. Now for the first actually good handheld console, the Nintendo Game & Watch. This was a series of portable consoles which used flickering and fixed graphics to give the illusion of movement. They were very cheap, low-powered, and much smaller than other handhelds at the time. Eventually, they started turning their focus to the Game Boy, and stopped producing the Game & Watch series. This is the first of VTech's notable consoles, the Eeveelution. It was a hybrid computer and game console. While it had decent hardware, it didn't stand out from the crowd whatsoever. And now we move out of the second generation and into the third generation of consoles, but not before taking a look at the crash of 1983. I talked about it quite a bit, but I never explained it. Basically, due to an oversaturation of cartridges, the gaming market suffered. It was devastating to video game companies, and only the big ones survived, such as Atari or Nintendo. But now we can move on to the third generation. The gaming industry is at its low right now. Once the NES is released, everything will change. Forever. For better or for worse. But right now, we look at Sega's first console, the Sega SG-1000. The Sega SG-1000 featured more complex games, and larger, more colorful, and more detailed sprite graphics. Even though it had all this, it faced a huge market, and it sold pretty badly. They also developed a second one as well, with a much better controller, but it didn't sell nearly as well as the Famicom. Speaking of the Nintendo Famicom, there were over 1,000 games made for it. It gained a lot of success, even in this heavy competition, because of very good first-party games. You know, the classics like Super Mario. The controller also had a built-in microphone, though few games used it. The Famicom also had the disk system as well, which gave it the ability to read floppy disks, the ability to save, and it could feature much more complex and larger games, such as Metroid or The Legend of Zelda. Nintendo then released the Famicom worldwide and called it the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short. This was a huge success and established Nintendo as the biggest gaming company in the world at the time, and revitalized the gaming industry. Sega is back with the Sega Master System, which sold incredibly well in Europe and South America, and outsold the Famicom in those areas. Now with their footing in Europe and South America, I wonder what they'll do next. Atari is also back again with the Atari 7800, which didn't sell anywhere close to Nintendo's numbers. As you'll see, Atari is going to go downhill from here, and really from the 2600, with usually bad marketing and bad third-party titles. Now, the story of the RDI Halcyon is a story of great sadness and sorrow. Rick Dyer wanted to make an incredibly ambitious game called Shadowne. I don't think I pronounced that correctly, but we'll go with it. He wanted to make a smaller scale spin-off. That game was Dragon's Lair, which was a huge success. With all this, he would release his own game, but he needed his own console first. Then he went bankrupt immediately after starting the production. I think I know why he failed. The price was $2,195, or almost $6,000 adjusted for inflation, to buy a console. I mean, at least he released his game. On a lighter note, VTech is back once again with an edutainment console, the VTech Socrates. There were a whopping 8 games released on this console, so it's safe to say that it was a huge flop. It did have a wireless keyboard though, so that's pretty cool. The 4th generation. Now 16-bit is the standard, and the market is much more aggressive. The first console we start out with is the NEC PC Engine. Quite a mouthful. This tiny little guy had nice 16-bit visuals, though it wasn't a true 16-bit console with only an 8-bit CPU. Though it did have a pretty big following in Japan. It sold horribly in the US. They also had a few other models, including the Core Graphics and the Core Graphics 2. Atari is somehow still here and is very desperate now, with the release of the Atari XE game system, which sold very badly, of course, because no one cares about Atari anymore. Please, you got your millions of dollars, so stop wasting them all. Where we last left off with Sega, they had their footing in Europe and South America. Now, with the release of the Sega Mega Drive, which is super fun to say by the way, they were planning to take over the Japanese market. They were also planning to take over the Western market with the release of a much more boring sounding name, the Sega Genesis. This all went according to plan, with an aggressive ad campaign. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. With this, Sega finally has their name out there. And now, for the fight you've all been waiting for, the fight of the handhelds. Let's introduce the competition. Here we have the Game Boy, which sold over 115 million systems. It's going to be very tough for the other consoles to compete. The battery lasts for over 20 hours, and sure, it doesn't have color, but it's also very cheap. Next, we have the Sega Game Gear, which has color and is much cheaper than our other contestant, though the battery only lasts for about 5 hours. Lastly, we have the Atari Lynx, which also had color and consumed batteries in about 5 hours. With all that, let's see who wins. Atari is already out, obviously, and it looks like the Game Boy came out on top. What a surprise! Wasn't that fight exhilarating? Well, I guess you couldn't see it, but I could see it, and it was pretty exhilarating. Anyway, Nintendo has already come back with another hit, the Super Famicom, or as it's known in the rest of the world, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or the SNES. Not much to say here, just another huge hit by Nintendo. Commodore is finally back after 6 years with the Commodore CD-TV, which was a computer with a built-in CD drive, and was the start of the CD format. Although CDs are much better than floppy disks, the console was very expensive and didn't sell too well because of it. And now, for the fight you probably never wanted, the fight of the rip-off handhelds. In this corner, we have the Gamate, which sold for almost the same price as the Game Boy. It also had a pretty bad processor and not a lot of RAM. Next, we have the Wireless Supervision, which is almost half the price of the Game Boy and has pretty decent everything, except a big library of games. Last but not least is the Megaduck, which sold for £60 and was a 1-to-1 clone of the Game Boy, and didn't have nearly as good of a library as the Game Boys. Now, with all this said, we will now start the fight. Go! The Gamate is obviously out already. It looks like... the water has come out on top. I mean, it was featured on a gaming TV show, so that has to be something. Man, things are looking pretty boring with Nintendo just dominating the market. I mean, sure, there was the Sega Genesis, but aside from that, they don't really have a rival. Man. I wish the 5th generation would spice things up and add a new competitor. Well, actually, that is what happened, but we'll get back to that later. In the meantime, Atari is back with yet another console, the Atari Jaguar, which had only 80 games released on it, and only sold 150,000 copies in 3 years. This was one of the biggest flops in video game history. Atari then left the gaming market for good. Sega's come back with another pretty big hit, at least in Japan, the Sega Saturn. It was the go-to console for 2D fighting games. It was a huge failure overseas, though, and that failure would severely hurt Sega. It was also about now that Sega became obsessed with the internet and online play, which you'll see a little later. I mean, online games are super popular now, right? So they must have popularized it, right? Hey look, longtime movie company Sony wants to get in on the video game craze. You see, Nintendo and Sony were going to team up and release a console together. Then Nintendo canceled at the last minute, and Sony, filled with rage, came out with their own console to show Nintendo what they were capable of. This console was the PlayStation. They became Nintendo's biggest rival, with great titles and amazing 3D graphics. The PlayStation then went on to sell over 100 million systems. Nintendo looks pretty interested in this new technology, VR. Their first shot at it was the Virtual Boy. This seizure-inducing console was nothing special, and was really bad, with such great titles as Nestor's Funky Bowling, Space Squashers, and, of course, Dragon Hoppers. Now with Nintendo's serious console, the N64, a 64-bit system with very advanced 3D graphics, much better than that stupid PlayStation. The console's expensive cartridges deterred third-party developers, though. With huge hits like Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time, it was able to sell over 30 million systems. Definitely not as much as the PlayStation, though. Now for yet another fight. I swear, this one's the last one. This time with the color handhelds. Firstly, the Game Boy Color. With a very good lineup of games, the other consoles have to have some really good games to be able to compete. Next, the Neo Geo Pocket is the same price, but it doesn't have anywhere near as good of a processor, and it doesn't have that much RAM either. Lastly is the Wonder Swan, which is very popular for its puzzle games, and you can even play Final Fantasy on it as well. Now, let the fight begin! Neo Geo is out with a pretty mediocre lineup of games, and it looks like the Game Boy Color has already won, selling nearly 120 million copies, while the Wonder Swan sold a measly 3.5 million. Remember the NEC PC Engine? Well, now the 32-bit successor is here. It sold very badly. It was expensive, underpowered, and it couldn't even render 3D. It was still stuck with 2D sprites. Due to this failure, NEC dropped out of the market entirely. Next is TigerGame.com. This handheld had a touchscreen and stylus, a built-in calendar, a phone book, and a calculator. It even had Resident Evil. Well, I mean, that one's kind of true, if you count a bad port with choppy frame rates and bad gameplay, Resident Evil 2. Which, I mean, yeah, I guess it is, but still, it's a really bad port. That's what I'm trying to say. The games were bad ports of other games. That's what I'm trying to say. Now the start of another generation, the 6th generation. This generation is home to many popular consoles, such as the PS2, the Xbox, and the GameCube. Not the GameCube so much, but anyway, first we must talk about the Dreamcast. Sega was desperately trying to stay afloat, panicking, trying to think of an idea. They saw a vision of RN Jesus. Yes, RN Jesus himself.
Online games.
The Ultimate Gamer said, Sega understood what they must do. They must make the Dreamcast. This online console could bring players together from all over the world. They saw the future of gaming, but no one believed them, and Sega dropped out of the hardware business for good. They were just too ahead of their time. But you know what was super successful? The PS2, the best-selling video game console of all time, selling over 155 million systems and had over 2,400 games published on it. This huge success easily beat out the GameCube and the Xbox. Speaking of which, the GameCube was a small success by Nintendo, selling only 21 million consoles, not nearly as much as the PS2. It was about this time that Nintendo accepted that they weren't as good as Sony. And as soon as they did that, they beat Sony in systems sold. But we'll get to that soon. But while Nintendo was losing in the home console department, they did succeed in the handheld department, mostly because they were the only ones in that department. This console, the Game Boy Advance, sold over 80 million systems. While not being as much of a success as the PS2, it still sold very well. They also released the Game Boy Advance SP, which had a built-in rechargeable battery and a front-lit screen. Oh look, a newcomer, Microsoft! The PS2 caught the attention of this tech juggernaut, and they thought they could be a fierce rival to the PlayStation. So they created the Xbox, which only sold 24 million systems. Not the huge success Microsoft had in mind. Someone decided that they could rival the Game Boy Advance. Who was this company? Nokia. You know, the makers of the phone that could only play Snake? This incredible console was the Nokia N-Gage. Was it a success? No, it only sold 3 million systems. I mean, it had a cool Elder Scrolls spin-off. VTech is back with another console, VTech V.Smile, a console to educate kids and a less edgy alternative to the PS2 and the Xbox. And it was almost $250 cheaper. And you know a console's good when the pack-in game is Alphabet Park. Now, we move on to the 7th generation. Things are getting pretty boring with Microsoft, Nintendo, and Sony dominating the market. Remember when I said it was too boring when Nintendo was dominating the market? Well, Sony and Microsoft got pretty old pretty quickly. It's just too hard for other companies to compete with very advanced 3D and a lot more RAM and better processors than ever before. It's just way too expensive. Anyway, let's start off with one of the best handhelds ever made, the DS. The DS. Wow. The DS had so many great games, and it could access the internet. See, I told you Sega was right. It also had a dual screen, which was a really interesting gimmick, and let it stand out from the crowd. In total, it sold about 154 million systems, 1 million shy of the PS2. Sony saw what success Nintendo had with portable consoles, so they decided to make their own as well. What did they make? The PlayStation Portable, or the PSP for short. It was a pretty big success, selling more than 80 million systems, about as much as the Game Boy Advance. Though it definitely was not as much as a success as Nintendo's DS. The DS wasn't the only success that Nintendo had. They also made the Wii. Instead of competing with Sony with 1080p and HD graphics, they made something unique. This family-friendly console used motion controls with this stick. See, I told you it looks like the Microvision. With this console, they finally beat Sony and Microsoft. And at least the motion controls were better than the Power Glove. Coming in second in this generation, the Xbox 360, which just barely sold more than the PS3, selling 84 million systems while the PS3 sold 80 million. And who can forget the Red Ring of Death, the glitch that lost Microsoft millions of dollars. Lastly, the PS3, which has nothing interesting to note, but they do have a rip-off Wii called the PlayStation Move. They even have a game called Sports Champion. Yeah, don't see any similarities here. VTech is still alive and has made a new console, the VTech V.Flash, with one of the best sounding pack-in game names ever, Wacky Race on Jumpin' Bean Island. Sadly, it was discontinued with only 9 games released on it. They haven't made another console since. I wonder what they're up to now. Oh right, a huge security breach. I almost forgot about that. Well, I think that was a good way to wrap up the 7th generation. Now on to the next. Now, I'm sure most of us are familiar with the 8th generation consoles, such as the 3DS, the Nintendo Switch, or the PS4, so I'll just breeze over those ones. First off, we start with the 3DS, the improved version of the DS. This console didn't sell as many consoles as the DS, only selling about 76 million. Still, definitely a success though. But do you know what wasn't a success? The PS Vita. This handheld only sold 16 million systems. A huge flop. Not as much as a flop as the Wii U, which we'll get to later, But it was enough of a flop that PlayStation never made another handheld console again, so that's a pretty big flop. Now for the Wii U. This console was even more of a flop than the PS Vita. This console only sold about 13 million systems, 3 million less than the PS Vita. Nothing really interesting about this one. Well, I guess Amiibo was pretty neat, but nothing really else to note. Everyone knows about the PS4, the Xbox, and the Nintendo Switch series now, I guess. So, I'll just skip those ones. Then there are also what I like to call third-party consoles, which are all exactly the same. They all have their own store over the internet, of course, as their quote-unquote gimmick, although I don't think you can even count it as a gimmick anymore because they're all like that. And they were also all huge flops, so yeah. And now we're at the present, with your PS5 and Microsoft still not knowing how to count. Well, actually, there is one more console I still need to talk about. Remember when I said that Atari never made another console ever again? Well, I lied! Yes, aside from making a cryptocurrency, buying the lease to a few hotels and then immediately losing them, they made the Atari VCS, a PC alternative which wasn't really received all that well. I probably shouldn't have even mentioned it, it's not really that interesting, but, well, it's too late now. Well, I'm done. I talked a lot about video game consoles, but hey, I'm just the beginning of the rabbit hole. If you're interested in this, you can dig deeper if you want. Well, I spent many hours on this, so please like and subscribe. You should probably do that. Please. Thank you. I don't know if you did or not, but I'm just assuming you did, so I'm saying thank you. So thank you. Well, I guess that's all. Goodbye.